The files remained closed. Adam and Charlie were miles away, seeking the clean anonymity of a coastal vacation. But the regions they left behind, the forgotten corners of the country, were full of old debts and heavy history. The legends weren't written in concrete or steel. They were inscribed in the very soil. The soil of Elias's farm was dust. The sun was a searing, indifferent eye in the pale sky, baking the earth into a brittle, uniform gray. Elias, an old, desperate man whose face was etched with decades of sun and worry, moved with the slow, defeated gait of someone who knew the battle was lost. The drought was absolute, relentless, and unforgiving. His corn stood withered and brown, the stalks brittle skeletons mocking the sky. He was weeks away from losing the farm, generations of land swallowed by the bank's relentless paperwork. He lived with his granddaughter Anna, a solemn, quiet girl of 9, whose face carried the inherited sorrow of the dying land. Driven by a final desperate hope, Elias was attempting to dig a new well, far from the collapsed main pump. The work was futile. The soil, devoid of moisture, came up in choking clouds of gray powder that instantly coated his throat. His shovel rang out with a sharp metallic clang. He had hit something hard, deep beneath the surface where water should have been. Elias cleared the choking dust, his muscles screaming in protest. He unearthed the object slowly. It was a thick, rot-resistant wooden pole, ancient and dark, its surface unnaturally smooth. Attached to the pole, bound tightly with thick waxed twine, was a heavy, sagging form wrapped completely in stained, yellowed burlap. It was a scarecrow. It was unlike any field decoration Elias had ever seen. The material was impossibly preserved, and the air around the object felt dense and strangely hot. When he finally pulled the whole structure free, dragging it into the harsh sunlight, the scent was overpowering. A profound mix of cold, subterranean earth and the unmistakable metallic tang of dried old blood. The burlap was heavy, suggesting a dense core, perhaps packed with stone or bone. The scarecrow's wooden pole was deliberately carved with faint, repeating symbols that Elias didn't recognize. He knew with the cold certainty of a man tied to the land that this object was ancient, dark, and deliberately buried. He looked at his dying field, at the cracked earth that had given him nothing. He looked at the sinister burlap-racked figure radiating its strange, dry heat. He knew the risk was immense, the object clearly belonging to a time when desperation was answered with dangerous bargains. Elias hoisted the pole onto his shoulder. He carried the silent, heavy scarecrow to the center of his desiccated cornfield. He hammered the base deep into the gray dust. He set it up, facing the unforgiving sun, hoping against hope that the strange, dark sentinel would bring not rain, but some kind of terrifying, necessary luck. The morning arrived, bringing the same searing, indifferent sun, but the atmosphere had changed. Elias woke with a tense, shallow feeling in his chest, the heavy scent of old blood and dry earth from the scarecrow still lingering in his mind. He went immediately to the field. The first thing he saw was not a miracle, but a payment. Lying precisely at the base of the ancient wooden pole was a dead crow. It was large and black, but its death was utterly unnatural. Its neck was snapped clean, and the bird looked strangely deflated, its feathers sticking to its body as if all the moisture had been violently squeezed out of its form. The killing was clean, efficient, and silently attributed to the ominous sentinel now dominating the field. Elias stared at the corpse, a cold dread tightening in his stomach. He didn't touch the crow. He quickly moved away, burying the small, dark body near the fence line, recognizing the cost. He looked at the sky. It was still pale and relentless, but then, as he worked near the broken pump, the light began to change. Dark, heavy clouds began to boil over the western ridge of the valley. They were not the wispy, high clouds of a false promise. They were thick, purple-black masses, dense with immense moisture. They moved with unnatural speed, converging directly over the small, desiccated patch of Elias's farm. The world outside his perimeter remained bright and dry, but over his fields the clouds gathered, massive and immediate. Then the rain started. It was not a gentle drizzle or a passing shower. It was a violent, miraculous downpour, heavy, cold, drumming rain that fell with focused intensity. It was raining only on Elias's land. The line of the downpour was sharp and clean. 20 yards past his fence, the neighboring dust remained undisturbed. Elias fell to his knees in the sudden, soaking torrent, tears mingling with the cold, blessed water. The sound of the rain hitting the parched earth was deafening, a sound of life returning. The change in the land was immediate and unsettling. The gray, dusty soil instantly drank the water, turning a rich, dark brown. The withered stalks of corn and the skeletal remains of his vegetables began to perk up. They turned a shade of unnatural, vivid green, a color too deep, too vibrant, too sudden for healthy growth. They looked unnaturally robust, absorbing the water with desperate, visible speed. Elias stood in the center of the downpour, feeling the cold water stream down his face, his relief immense and profound. The farm was saved. The bank wouldn't take his land. He looked toward the center of the field, toward the source of his luck. The Scarecrow, the burlap-wrapped figure, stood firm against the deluge. As Elias watched, a new seed of dread planted itself deep in his mind. He was certain that the ancient wooden pole, anchored deep into the wet earth, had turned its head slightly. The burlap-wrapped mass was no longer facing the relentless sun. It was facing the house. Elias quickly wiped the water from his eyes. "It's the wind," he told himself, though the air was perfectly calm beneath the heavy cloud cover. "The rope is loose." He dismissed the unnerving change, but the feeling lingered. The trade had been accepted, and the mysterious sentinel was now watching its new domain. A week passed in a state of unnerving, unnatural bounty. The rain had ceased entirely after the initial miraculous downpour, yet the crops did not wither. They grew with furious, terrifying speed. The corn stalks were impossibly thick, the cobs huge and golden, ripening weeks ahead of schedule. The vivid green was now a terrifying, robust gold. The impossible harvest was secure, but the cost was becoming clear. Elias walked his field every morning, his heavy boots sinking into the unnaturally rich, damp soil. He avoided looking directly at the Scarecrow, but he couldn't deny the change. The ancient burlap-wrapped figure looked closer than it had the day before. The brole hadn't moved, but the sheer presence of the dark sentinel seemed to occupy more of the visual space, dominating the field with its ominous bulk. The skies remained pale and dry, and Elias knew the bounty was conditional. The entity wanted a trade. That night, the quiet of the farm was shattered by sound. Elias woke abruptly to the frantic, guttural barking of his loyal farm dog, Buster. The sound was not playful or territorial. It was pure, unadulterated fear and rage. Elias ran to the window. Buster was outside, standing rigid near the fence line, barking madly, relentlessly, his focus locked entirely on the burlap-wrapped figure in the center of the field. The Scarecrow stood silent, vast, and utterly indifferent to the dog's desperate warning. Elias felt a cold knot of certainty tighten in his stomach. The dog was an anchor to the simple, honest life of the farm, and the entity was demanding its price. He didn't intervene. He stood paralyzed at the window, watching the desperate, futile fury of his loyal animal, and waited. By morning, the barking had stopped. The farm was returned to its heavy, isolating silence. Elias walked slowly to the field, the golden corn stalks rustling ominously around him. Buster was gone. He reached the base of the Scarecrow. The burlap-wrapped figure seemed even larger now, its massive presence pulling the light from the sky. Hanging precisely from the rough wooden crosspiece that served as its hand was Buster's collar, a worn leather strap with a faded brass tag. The leather was clean, dry, and cold to the touch. Elias dropped the collar instantly, stumbling backward onto the rich, dark soil. The realization was sickening. The greed that had fueled his desperate hope dissolved, replaced by a profound, cold guilt that tasted like ash. He had sacrificed the loyalty of his friend for the promise of gold. He looked back at the house, unable to meet the gaze of his young granddaughter. He looked at the bounty. During the night, the corn stalks had visibly grown. The cobs were now monstrously large, the gold an obscene, terrifying color. The crops had doubled in size overnight, reaching an impossible height. The trade had been accepted. The silence of the morning was the sound of a debt paid and a soul darkened. The land was safe, but Elias was lost. Elias spent the remainder of the day in a haze of fear and self-loathing. The cold reality of the collar resting on the ground, a constant accusation. The vibrant, impossible bounty of the cornfield, now guaranteed, felt like a mockery. He avoided the fields until late afternoon, when the heat finally began to break. When he finally looked out the kitchen window, the sight delivered a punch of icy terror that surpassed the morning's dread. The Scarecrow was gone from the center of the field. It was now standing at the fence line, exactly 20 yards from the farmhouse, its massive pole thrust deep into the rich, dark soil. It was positioned directly in front of the kitchen window, its burlap-wrapped mass facing the house. It hadn't moved like a structure. It had moved like a conscious entity. The distance had been annihilated without a sound. The burlap head, which had previously been a vague, featureless sack, now looked taut, molded by an unseen pressure from within. The stitched mouth, crude black thread against the yellowed fabric, looked wider, pulled into a silent, terrifying, consuming smile. Elias quickly retreated from the window, his breath shallow and rapid. He focused frantically on the figures. The numbers on the profit margin, the absolute assurance that the bank would be paid and the land would be saved were his only remaining anchor. He told himself the post had sunk, the wind had shifted the perspective, but the air around the house was dead still. He spent the evening moving furniture. He dragged the heavy oak dining table against the front door and jammed chairs under the knobs. He bolted every window shut, working with desperate, silent haste, knowing that wood and glass were pathetic barriers against the entity that had twisted a large man's perspective and killed a loyal dog. Night fell, vast and absolute. The farmhouse was plunged into a desperate, shadowed vigil. At precisely 1 a.m., the horror began. Elias heard it first, a faint, deliberate crunching sound coming from the yard. It was the sound of something heavy dragging across the dry, remaining patches of gravel near the porch steps. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the sound of heavy wooden footsteps, the thick, ancient pole being dragged slowly, inexorably across the porch. Schluck, schluck, schluck. The sound was slow, measured, and unstoppable. It moved from the side steps directly to the front door where the oak table was jammed. The heavy, resonant scrape stopped directly on the welcome mat. Elias stood motionless in the darkness of the hall, clutching a rusty hunting rifle. He knew the entity was waiting, demanding its due. Driven by a desperate, sickening logic, the same avarice that had allowed him to ignore the fate of his dog, Elias backed away from the door. He wouldn't offer himself, but the creature had shown a preference for simple life. He moved quickly and silently through the dark house and out the back door, heading for the small metal-roofed shed where the remaining farm animals were kept. The horses and cows were gone, sold off months ago to cover debts, but he had kept 3 goats for milk. The animal shed was a chaos of sound and fear. The 2 remaining goats were bleating and kicking violently in their stalls, their terror amplified by the close proximity of the unseen predator. Elias chose the largest one, a stubborn male. He wrestled the terrified animal out, securing a thick rope around its neck. He dragged the struggling, frightened goat toward the front of the house. The creature outside the door remained silent, waiting. Elias unbolted the back door just enough to shove the heavy, struggling animal out onto the porch. He quickly secured the rope to the porch railing and slammed the door shut, locking the bolt with a final desperate clang. He retreated to the dark living room, his mind numb with guilt and expediency. He pressed his face against the cold wood of the wall, listening to the terrible, unequal exchange. The goat's terrified bleating was immediately muffled, replaced by a desperate, frantic struggle. Then, a chilling, wet, tearing sound, a hideous noise of muscle and sinew being ripped apart, followed by a single, sharp gurgle. Then, silence. The profound quiet returned, thicker and colder than before. Elias stood rigid, waiting for the heavy wooden footsteps to resume, waiting for the next sound. But the porch remained silent. The exchange had been accepted. The landlord was satisfied. He waited until the first weak, cold light of dawn filtered through the windows before moving. He crept to the front door, slowly pulling the heavy furniture aside, his heart hammering against his ribs. He eased the front door open. The porch was clean. The goat was gone, leaving only a few strands of dark hair and a small, fresh scrape mark on the railing where the rope had been secured. Elias looked out onto the yard, the rising sun casting long, pale shadows over the unnaturally rich, damp soil. The gold corn stood tall and dense. And standing silently, utterly still, only 20 feet from the house, right next to the small, rusty swing set where his granddaughter Anna played during the brief hours of sunshine, was the Scarecrow. It was inside the yard now, its massive pole thrust deep into the flower bed. The burlap head drawn tight over an unseen rigid core was no longer just featureless. Across the pale fabric of the face, a dark, fresh, wet stain had appeared, spreading slowly outward. It was a terrifying, dark patch that looked sickeningly full. The cold certainty struck Elias with the force of a physical blow. The sacrifice of the animals was no longer enough. The landlord was moving closer to collect the final, most terrible rent. He locked the doors, his movements slow and defeated, but sleep was impossible. He sat up all night clutching the rusty rifle, the silence outside the house immense, broken only by the sound of his own shallow, ragged breathing. He watched the digital clock on the mantel, praying for the morning light. He must have drifted off. Elias awoke abruptly to a profound, absolute silence. The sun was up, but the house was unnervingly quiet. He felt the cold air immediately. He looked at the front door. The heavy oak door, which he had securely bolted, was wide open. The morning light poured in, illuminating the fine layer of dust on the hall floor. A surge of pure, agonizing adrenaline coursed through him. "Anna!" He sprang from the sofa, the rifle heavy and cold in his hands, and raced toward the hall. He knew the creature wasn't outside anymore. He stopped dead at the foot of the staircase. The Scarecrow was standing there. It had moved from the yard, across the porch, and through the open front door. Its massive pole was anchored on the old wooden step. It stood directly at the foot of the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. Its immense bulk filled the space, the early morning light casting a long, terrifying shadow that climbed the stairs toward the sleeping quarters. The creature's right arm, the heavy, cloth-wrapped stick, was slowly, deliberately raised. It wasn't pointing at Elias. It was pointing a stiff, straw-filled finger directly at the top of the stairs, at the closed door of Anna's room. The terrible truth crystallized. The bounty had been paid in livestock. Now the final installment was due. The creature did not want livestock anymore. It wanted the innocent human life tied to the land. "Get out!" Elias screamed, his voice raw and broken, his profound fury momentarily overwhelming his profound fear. "Leave her! Get out of my house!" He raised the rifle, leveling the barrel at the center of the burlap chest. He knew the risk was immense, the cost of missing catastrophic, but he wouldn't allow the horror to reach his granddaughter. Elias pulled the trigger. The blast was immense, deafening and concussive in the confined space of the hall. The heavy shotgun pellets slammed into the burlap chest with terrifying force, tearing a jagged, massive hole in the center of the creature's body. The impact momentarily obscured the figure in a cloud of dust and ripped fabric. The sound faded, replaced by the terrifying silence of the aftermath. Elias stared, horrified. The creature did not fall. It did not even sway. The burlap-wrapped figure stood firm, its ominous pole anchored to the step. And from the massive, ragged hole where the blast had struck, there was no dried straw or dirt. Instead, a thick, black sludge, viscous, oily, and smelling powerfully of burnt earth and old blood, began to slowly ooze and bleed from the wound. The Scarecrow let its arm drop. It made no sound. It simply stood there, dripping its foul internal fluid onto the wooden steps, its massive body unyielding, waiting for Elias to move. The exchange was now a final, inescapable battle for the soul of the farm. The creature stood firm, dripping thick black sludge from the shotgun blast, its unyielding presence blocking the ascent to Anna's room. Elias knew another shot was useless. The creature was impervious to lead, its form sustained by something deeper than flesh. He backed away slowly, his eyes locked on the dripping silhouette. The solution wasn't violence, it was purification. He had invited the blight with greed, and fire was the only cleansing agent left. He rushed silently upstairs, waking the terrified Anna. "Anna, listen to Grandpa. Go hide in the old root cellar. Don't make a sound and don't come out until morning. I love you." Anna, seeing the raw terror and resignation in his eyes, obeyed without question, slipping quietly out the back door toward the barn. Elias then gathered his arsenal, a thick coil of rope, a jerry can full of kerosene, paint thinner, and the long, thin shovel he had used to unearth the curse. Night fell, vast and absolute, sealing the house in darkness. The moon, hidden by heavy clouds, offered no light. He could hear the terrifying, continuous schluck of the creature's viscous fluids dripping onto the wooden steps. He moved to the porch, his blood cold with fear and resolve. He did not confront the creature inside the house. Using the heavy rope, he carefully tethered the creature's pole to the support column of the porch, securing it in place. He then retrieved the can of kerosene.
"You took my kindness, you took my dog, and you demanded my blood," Elias whispered, his voice trembling as he doused the burlap-wrapped figure. The flammable liquid saturated the thick cloth and the black sludge beneath, mixing with the sickening scent of old blood. Elias struck a match. He took one final look at the immobile, dripping creature and tossed the lit match onto the soaking burlap. The fire was immediate, immense, and savage. The Scarecrow instantly erupted in a towering column of brilliant, hungry flame. The thick, acrid black sludge bubbled and burned with unnatural ferocity, and the Scarecrow began to thrash violently, roaring a muffled, agonizing sound that was horribly like a human scream. The terror was immense, but Elias waited, watching the flames consume the horror. As the ancient burlap mask burned away, exposing the core of the creature, Elias saw the face beneath. Elias gasped, his mind shattering instantly. It wasn't a demon's face or a monster's. It was his own face, old, desperate, and utterly consumed by malice and decay. The skin was blackened, the features stretched and ruined, reflecting the profound greed he had harbored in his soul. The Scarecrow was not an external demon. It was a physical manifestation of Elias's own moral failure, brought to life by the Dark Pact. The burning figure tore itself free from the pole. It lurched forward, its massive, flaming arms outstretched. It ignored the fire and focused entirely on Elias. "You paid the price," the muffled, burning voice shrieked. "You are mine."
The burning figure seized Elias in a sudden, brutal, flaming hug. The heat was immediate and agonizing, fire consuming flesh. Elias screamed, a final despairing sound of realization and pain, as the spirit of his own avarice claimed him. The fire spread instantly, fueled by the dry porch wood and the remaining kerosene. The old farmhouse, having witnessed generations of quiet desperation, erupted into a towering inferno, illuminating the vast, silent valley with its terrible, destructive light. Then, the final bizarre turn of the contract occurred. As the flames reached their zenith, heavy, sudden rain began to fall.
It was not a gentle shower, it was a deluge, the same focused, miraculous downpour that had saved the crops a week prior. The water hammered the burning structure, fighting the chemical flames with relentless, concentrated force. The house was consumed, but the fire was extinguished, leaving behind a smoking, sodden ruin. The sun rose the next morning over a scene of profound contradiction. The neighbors, alerted by the distant smoke, found the farmhouse a blackened, waterlogged husk. But the fields surrounding the ruin were terrifyingly alive. The corn was immense, impossibly tall and golden, the largest, richest harvest in the history of the county. The soil was unnaturally dark and damp. The neighbors searched the ruins of the cellar, finding Anna safe, huddled beneath the upturned root bins, trembling but physically unharmed. She was silent, her eyes holding the immense vacant stare of a child who had seen unspeakable things. The police and local fire marshals spent hours sifting through the waterlogged debris. They found no trace of Elias's remains near the porch. The only evidence of his final struggle was the immense scorch mark on the wood and the overwhelming acrid smell of burnt material. Elias's body was missing. Then, a young deputy pointed toward the center of the impossibly lush cornfield. There, dominating the rich, dark earth, was a new scarecrow. It was freshly made. The central pole was new, the frame sturdy, but the attire was profoundly unsettling. It was dressed in Elias's familiar burnt flannel jacket and his heavy work pants, the clothes he had been wearing when he was consumed by the fire. The face was hidden behind a fresh, clean burlap mask, meticulously stitched closed. The mask was featureless, yet its presence radiated a cold, absolute silence that spoke volumes. The neighbors approached cautiously. As the morning light hit the burlap, they saw the most terrifying detail: the eyes. Through two small, rough-cut holes in the fabric, they could see the terrible reflection of the dawn. The eyes visible in the shadow were undeniably human, wide, desperate, and utterly consumed by eternal terror. The cycle was complete. Elias had saved his land, but the payment had been extracted, and he had been bound to the earth to guard the cursed harvest. The quiet, tragic price of the bargain was paid, and the land would never again suffer drought. The harvest always demands a price. Tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you would never trade for money? If you want to hear the next legend from the road, subscribe.